But tonight, Democrats are piling on, using Trump Jr.'s newly revealed email chain as yet another Russian smokescreen, all designed to derail the GOP agenda. But the question is, and the one we should all be asking, is was this simply a lapse in judgment, or did Donald Trump Jr. actually break the law? That is where we begin tonight with Fox News contributor DeRoy Murdoch and former Ohio State Senator Capri Cafaro. Good to have you both here. DeRoy, first to you. Did he do something illegal?
Look, I think this whole thing, when you get to the bottom of it, is a bit like referring to two people who go out on a blind date as a happily married couple. Yes, there was this email, eventually ended up with this meeting between or among Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort. It lasted about 20 minutes. They got the sense that the lawyer who came in, the Russian lawyer, really didn't have anything to say. Her story didn't make sense. That was the end of it. There was not a follow-up with endless microfilm coming in from Moscow and KGB agents turning over Hillary's graduate records or tax records or whatever. That's it. I'll add up to a 20-minute meeting. That was the end of it. So like I say, it's a bit like referring to people going on a blind date as a happy married couple.
I don't know if I get that analogy, but I'll save that for another time. But I mean, I'm looking at it. I'm saying to myself, Capri, it's free country. Right? You are allowed to talk to anyone you want, including internationally. There's a big difference between talking to someone who you think might have some interesting information and actually conspiring with someone to do something illegal.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, I'm not a lawyer and I don't purport to be one. And I think that, at this point, particularly because Donald Trump Jr. or anyone else in that room, Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner at the time, none of those people were representatives of the United States government. So, they were acting in a campaign capacity. And I think maybe that's where you differentiate between, illegality, collusion, et cetera, and just really trying to get to the bottom of what your opponent may have. Now, I read the email chain, and it certainly does seem from what was provided in that email chain that the Russians did want to provide some information and that the Russians did want to help Donald Trump. But I will say this, I don't necessarily think Donald Trump Jr. went in to go try to break the law.
So let's go with that premise. Let's assume that the Russians did want to help Donald Trump. And by the way, the Ukrainians wanted to help Hillary Clinton, and we have that one coming up later in the show.
Two wrongs, so big a right.
But that said, Donald Trump, we're going to go with that. Suppose the Russians wanted to see him win. Unless they've actually done anything illegal, talking to someone who works for Donald Trump, that in and of itself doesn't prove a darn thing. As Alan Dershowitz points out, actually, on the FoxNews.com website, I think we have an excerpt from that op-ed that I can share with you, but he's basically making the point, if we could run that, let me read it for you. Merely, in other words, there's a difference between actually doing something illegal or merely seeking to obtain the work product of a prior hack would be no more criminal, he says, than a newspaper DeRoy publishing the work product of theft, such as the Pentagon Papers and the material stolen by Snowden or Manning. In other words, nothing illegal has been done. Well, look, but they're out there looking for something that they might have on Hillary Clinton, and that in and of itself may not be a crime.
If I said, hey, Trish, I have some stolen Picassos. Are you interested in buying them? And you say, all right, well, let's talk about it. And after 20 minutes, you say, well, no, that's not right.
Yeah, but you've already told me it's stolen. I think this is a little different, right? Because it's not like they said, hey, we have some stolen information on Hillary Clinton.
It may be not even stolen information.
But the point
of all this is all of this add up to a 20-minute meeting, and after the 20-minute meeting, as far as we know, there's no follow-on action. Now, if this went on with endless meetings and contacts and flow of information, there might be something. As far as we can gather, this led to one meeting for 20 minutes, and that was the end of it.
This is a matter of optics, I think, more than anything else. I mean, I don't think at this point, again, I'm going to take Alan Dershowitz's word for it. I certainly trust his legal analysis. I think at this point, this is more about the optics that, someone from the Trump camp engaged with somebody from the Russians. Does that necessarily make that illegal? No. Does it look bad because they're a foreign entity? Probably, yeah.
Well, all right, let's talk about those optics, because Donald Trump Jr. is trying to get a handle on those optics right now. He's out in front of the New York Times releasing the emails. Donald Trump, the president, is saying, I applaud this transparency from my son. Is this the right way to go from an optics perspective, however, DeRoy? In other words, he's also simultaneously feeding this story.
Well, look, I think when you deal with public relations, one of the principles is if you have something bad to say, get it out now, rather than drag it out. And then people say, why did you wait so long to tell us? Maybe if we'd heard about this in November, that would have been more helpful. But what I want to know is that the Republicans control the House and the Senate. When will the Republicans hold a hearing on Uranium One, Hillary Clinton letting the Kremlin have 20% of the U.S. uranium supply in return for $145 million in donations to the Clinton Foundation? Why won't the Republicans hold a hearing on this and educate the American public on that example of collusion with Russia? They won't touch it, and the Republicans should talk about this.
But that's yesterday's news, right? I mean, she didn't get elected.
It's not, but no people don't know about this. Most people don't know about this,
I think that a lot of people looked at Hillary Clinton, and aside from some of the personality issues that they may have struggled with.
They've never had a hearing on Uranium One, and I think it's bribery. I think it's criminal, and the Republicans won't even talk about this. There ought to be hearings on this. They control the House. They control the Senate. We ought to have hearings on Uranium One.
I'm with you, but you know what? She didn't win. She's not there now. Nobody's as interested in her,
because
I agree with you.
People have to pay. There have to be consequences for people's actions. Just because you lose an election doesn't mean you get away with zero felonies.
And I will say this, that, you know, because you say it's yesterday's news, and you're absolutely right, but that doesn't necessarily take away the questions that are out there. So whether it is Hillary Clinton, whether it is, you know, Donald Trump Jr., whether it is, you know, the former FBI director, anyone who has a question raised, whether they've won or lost, whether they are currently, you know, the FBI director or not, the American public do deserve some kind of answers. But we also deserve deserve a government that is governing instead of spinning like tops.
For sure, there was. I mean, it's hard to look at that and not think there was something going on in terms of paying for access with the Global Foundation, their initiative that they had started. Her being Secretary of State, for sure that was messed up. And you're right to point out the Iranian example. That certainly makes this seem like nothing in comparison. I mean, this is kids' play, effectively, in comparison.
It's a 20-minute meeting versus